So I want to start by pointing out that the investment process uses this kind of option pricing framework in the sense that when you make a decision about whether or not to invest, you're actually exercising an option. So all of us have options embedded in our daily lives. You can decide whether or not you want to show up for final exams. If you don't show up, you'll pay the consequences, but nobody's forcing you. You have the option to do so. And that option can be valued. So things like opening or closing a mine, building or retiring an oil tanker, or undertaking a particular drug development project, those are examples of options that we all have access to in one form or another from a business perspective. So I want to give you an example of how that process of deciding how to take advantage of these opportunities can actually add value. And to do that, I want to start with a numerical example. Once I give you the numerical example, it's going to be obvious how you take this into account in practice. So here's the example. Suppose that we want to purchase manufacturing facilities to produce a particular drug for which we just got FDA approval. All right? Now, this is actually a challenge because in certain cases, particularly for rare diseases, and as you'll hear from our speakers later on, it's not at all clear that you can actually get quality manufacturers to provide the drug on an ongoing basis. In many cases, there are various subtle production processes that have to be followed, and if you don't follow these best practices, you end up getting tainted drugs, as we've seen in some legal cases recently in Massachusetts. Very serious problems. So it's important to be able to get the right manufacturing facilities. So you've got this drug approved, and now you are ready to go, but you need to actually make the drug. So it turns out that there's a plant that you can actually buy right now. And if you buy the plant right now, it's going to cost you, it's going to give you a net profit right now of $200 million if you buy the plant right now. However, we know that there are all sorts of issues with pricing, and it turns out that there's going to be some important legislation between now and next year that will determine the value of your drug. In the good case, your drug will be worth $300 million, but in the bad case, it'll be worth only $100 million. And so is it going to be worthwhile for you to buy the physical plant? The physical plant, if you bought it today, it's going to cost you $1.5 billion. But if you wait next year, it'll cost more. It'll cost $1.65 billion a year from now. So what do? Obviously, the drug can make $200 million today, but today is not what's relevant. What's relevant is what's going to happen tomorrow. And after next year's legislation, either it's going to be $300 million a year forever or $100 million a year forever. So you've got a problem. You've got to figure out whether or not you should build or buy the plant today or wait a year and buy the plant next year. How do you do that? This is where decision trees come in. So if you calculate the expected NPV without using decision trees, this is what you would get. So if I calculate the adjusted NPV, I pay $1.5 billion today, and I get $200 million today, right? That's what I'm going to be earning on my drug today. Plus, I get the expected value of my cash flows forever. And the expected value is going to be either 100 with 50% probability or 300 with 50% probability. So that gives me an NPV of 700. Okay? However, if I wait a year, then let's see what happens. If I wait a year, then in the good case, if the legislation gives me higher pricing, I get $300 million a year in profits. Then what is the company going to be worth? Well, it's going to be worth $1.65 billion, the cost, negative, plus an annuity, a perpetuity of 300, right? But what about the bad case if it's only worth 100? Well, if it's worth 100, I'm not going to bother with the acquisition. I'm not going to build the plant. I'm not going to actually, or buy the plant. I'm not going to go ahead. And so this is really the benefit of waiting. If I wait a year, I get to decide not to operate my plant. I get to decide not to make the acquisition and not to go ahead. That has value. How much value? Well, take a look at the NPV, 750. If I wait a year, even though I'm paying more for that plant, 1.65 billion versus 1.5, it's actually worth it. It's worth $50 million to me to wait a year. So the option value of being able to wait and decide not to buy the plant in the case of unfavorable legislation is the value of that option. Okay? The way that you can see this more clearly, at least for me, I find it more clear, is look for the nonlinearity. Where's the max, right? We have that max function. So here's where the max is. I can rewrite this expression here. I can rewrite this as this. The risk-adjusted NPV is going to be given by the expectation of the maximum of either this quantity here or nothing, where the random variable is what? What's the random variable in that expression? If I'm computing the expectation, I got to have a random variable. So what's random? Yeah. Exactly. X, the cash flow. That's either 300 or 100, depending on legislation, right? It's a very simple kind of randomness, but that's where it is. That's what the expectation is over. So once I see this maximum, I see, aha, that's the nonlinearity. That's the embedded option. That's where I'm creating value for my shareholders because I have the flexibility not to undertake a project if it's not to my benefit. And so in general, the way that you incorporate real option theory is nothing more nor less than going through this decision-making process and looking for all of the opportunities where you get to cherry pick your actions. You get to pick the best outcomes possible. Now, let me ask you a question. What if the owner of the plant isn't willing to wait a year? I just said 1.5 billion today, 1.65 billion tomorrow. What happens if he's not willing to take 1.56 million tomorrow?
Pay the owner up to $50 million.
Exactly right. You would be willing to pay me up to $50 million because that's what it's worth to you. So option pricing theory, real option pricing theory, is useful not just for figuring out what the right thing to do is, it's also very useful as a negotiating tool because now you know you've got $50 million of maneuvering room. Now, you might say, I don't really want to give up all 50 million. Maybe I'll be willing to compensate 10 million and keep the 40. But at least it gives you a baseline to be able to negotiate and figure out what your flexibility is in terms of being able to compensate people. Very useful. And simple once you understand it, but it's pretty complicated in the abstract because it relies on these kinds of nonlinearities. So I want to give you a little bit more of a complicated example. Before I do that, let me just mention one last thing, which is that this maximum function, it works exactly like a put option should by putting a floor. So effectively, what real option theory tells us is that we can create value for our shareholders by reducing risk, by cutting off the bad outcomes, the tail events in the left tail, okay? These maximum functions, the maximum of 0, it's basically telling you that I can prevent bad things from happening to some degree. Because in this case, where you don't know what's going to happen, effectively you are locked in to taking that plant even when the price goes down to 100 million, right? Because you bought the plant today. You are locked in. You have no more option. You are in it. And so no matter what the legislation does, you're going to suffer the consequences, including taking on a negative NPV project. What option pricing theory tells us is that that's never a good thing. If you can get out of taking a negative NPV project in the future, that's worth a lot. So let me give you a more complicated example because this way I think you'll be able to see a bit more about how it's going to work. Oh, by the way, yeah, another point that I want to make. We assume that there's no price uncertainty after the first year, right? That, in other words, it's just 300 or 100. But it could be anything. It could fluctuate between lots of different values. And you can use this recombining binomial tree, just like we did in the standard option pricing theory, to take into account all sorts of pricing uncertainty in the future.